I just watched Diana the musical on Netflix. Big mistake. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Scott. You're watching Inside Musicals, the channel for all things musical theatre. I did not like this musical. I did not like this show at all. I do not like it on TV. I do not like it, no siree. Not on the page, not on the net, not on the stage, nada. And yet, I'm not here to pillory the writers. Okay, I kind of am. But I know what it takes to get a commercial musical to the stage, and it's tough. So I admire anyone who does it. But this show is so off the mark, it makes me mad. I mean, I haven't felt this cheated since We Will Rock You. But at least that had great songs. And look, there's nothing quite like that breakout musical, that show that succeeds in spite of itself. And I'm thinking Rocky Horror Picture Show. On paper, but it's delicious, audacious. It has charm, finesse, and wit. And this show is nothing like that. And now I've watched it 3 times, just to be sure. Thrice. And thrice disappointed. And the most frustrating thing for me is it's not a total dog. I mean, it kind of is. But you know that saying, you can't polish a turd? Apparently you can. Sets and lighting, glossy, beautiful. The staging, slick. The show really moves. The orchestrations are impressive, if somewhat generic and sometimes misguided. The cast, that poor cast. Bravo, brave little soldiers. But all that's just window dressing if the underlying material doesn't deliver. And that's where it falls down for me, the story, the way it's conceived and the way it's told. You know, if you know the story of Diana, there's nothing new here. If you don't know the story, this is not a gripping yarn. It's not helped by the music and lyrics. So let's focus on character and story to see what we can learn, to see why it failed. Now, every musical needs to answer 2 questions before there's a note of music or a word of dialogue. Why this story? And why is a musical the best medium for it? And we'll come back to that at the end. Now, I like to think of story as an argument that has a point to make. Some people call it a premise. Now, an audience can agree or disagree with the premise, but it's up to the writer to at least make a compelling argument. Think of it as a persuasive essay. Argument, counter-argument, conclusion. In Romeo and Juliet, their impetuous love starts the trouble. It drives the drama, tests the characters, and then it brings it to a head when they impetuously kill themselves, thus proving the premise that impetuous love destroys itself. And every character in every scene belongs because it contributes to this argument. But in this show, the pieces don't come together so clearly, so it comes across as both confused and confusing. At the end of the show, Diana's pronounced dead, and the whole cast walk to the front of the stage and sing, "The people that will change the world are not the ones you think will change the world." Even putting aside the clunky lyric and the poorly stated premise, if it's a premise, it comes out of nowhere as though the writers are desperate for the show to have meaning. But the show's primary focus is Diana's bad marriage. We barely see her impact on the world. A couple of characters talk about her wanting to do charities. We see her in an AIDS clinic in one scene. And then at the end of the show, in the last 3 minutes, they list some of her achievements. So it's implausible that we should interpret the show as the people that change the world are not the ones you think will change the world. And what does that even mean? It's so generalised. Are they talking about Diana, that she changed the world? And if so, is it for better or worse? Or are they talking about the paparazzi who pursued her in the Paris tunnel? I don't know. As an audience, we need to experience the story with the characters. If the point of the show is that the world changes, we need to see how the world changes. And we need to feel that shift when it happens. Number 1 rule of stage or screen, show, don't tell. And so if it doesn't have a convincing premise, it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like a montage, just a series of events. Stuff just happens. But maybe you say, but it's a biography. Life is random. And that is true. But drama is selective, and it has to be, because whether it's stage or screen or a book, you need to condense those events into a limited time frame and make them make sense. Even journalists ask, well, what's the story here? And they sift through the facts to connect the relevant ones. In the film The Queen with Helen Mirren, it's the same characters, same facts, but they tell a different story. This is the week following Diana's death, and this is the Queen's perspective. Her personal dilemma is whether to maintain tradition and a dignified silence and be seen as out of touch, or whether to change with the times against her better judgment to be what the people want her to be. And she's dragged kicking and screaming into that decision. And even though Diana's dead, we feel her impact in the pressure from the people, the press, the Prime Minister. And so it proves how Diana changed the world, or at least the monarchy. And we feel that shift when it happens. The writers here know what they want to say, so they connect the facts so that we draw the same conclusion, that the Queen's change of heart was good. But in this musical, it's hard to draw any conclusions because although one scene leads logically enough to the next, there's never that sense of the metaphorical dramatic noose tightening around their necks, of the clock ticking down, options running out. It's as though these characters are just going through the motions of the plot. They're ticking the box to say this really happened and this really happened. Just because something really happened doesn't make it interesting, and setting it to music doesn't make it entertaining. So don't just tell me what happens, tell me why it matters. Because facts alone don't create meaning. And without meaning, we just don't care. So if we take away the song and dance, Diana the musical is really just a pedestrian chronology of Diana's marriage and divorce, and then they kind of take her death on at the end. It feels kind of like a research paper, literal and drab, point A to point B. And then between these 2 points is just Charles vacillating between 2 women. And please, I've seen better 3 ways at a T intersection. The reason we mock TV soaps is that they dwell on petty differences and call it drama. And that's what they do here.
Oh, Diana, we ought to be married. Oh, Charles, do you really love me? Of course I love you, whatever love means. Are you seeing that woman? I love Camilla. I hate Camilla. But I love her. I'll harm myself. You wouldn't dare. I'll take a lover. You wouldn't dare. I'll wear a nice frock in public. Oh, well, now I'm cross, ticked off. I'm really quite fed up. Mummy?
Wait, slight paraphrase. But the stakes don't really escalate until Diana goes public with the Andrew Morton biography. Because by then, the palace has to react. She forces their hand. But then that's almost at the end of Act 2. It's a little late to get the ball rolling on the drama. And look, the story's not short on ideas. The problem is they're just never fully developed. They're never followed through. In one scene, they introduce Barbara Cartland, the romance novelist, because apparently Diana was a great fan of her books. But she appears for a couple of scenes and then she's gone. She has absolutely no impact on the course of the story. She might as well be expendable. She's just expendable colour. I mean, it might have been interesting, or at least fun, if she was more pivotal to the story, like maybe a flawed fairy godmother character, an ever-present, misguided mentor whose marital advice only ever works in stories and never in the real world. But because Diana's obsessed with this fantasy version of marriage, she hangs on Barbara's every word until finally, when it all falls apart, Diana's like, no, shut up, no more fantasy, you don't know shit from shit. I'm pretty sure that's how princesses talk. Look, it's not a great idea, but it's an angle we've never seen before, and it's an abstract way of exploring why Diana so desperately clung to the marriage when it clearly wasn't working. Another undeveloped idea, the opening number. I think it's supposed to bookend the show. And I say I think, because she's wearing the same dress in both scenes, but it's never fully explained, so who knows. She presciently sings about her own future and how she's going to be underestimated, or in this show, overrated. And then a few scenes later, the Queen's staff inexplicably explain how Diana's going to be remembered for her looks. But this kind of commentary is never developed into a convention, so we kind of wonder, how do these characters know these things? And it makes absolutely no sense. Maybe if there was a consistent through line of fate closing in on Diana, like a Greek tragedy, then maybe we'd get it. But here it's just fortune-telling. It's just more facts at the expense of drama, as though facts make it credible. But story isn't objective. It's biased to make a point. Even documentaries aren't without bias. I mean, the ethical ones declare it, so they're not propaganda, but they have an agenda. And in drama, the main character embodies this agenda more than any other character. That's what makes them special. And when we feel for them, this becomes our bias, our perspective. And we don't identify with them because they're nice, or because they have more lines or more scenes. It's because they're uniquely qualified to drive the story, usually because of some inequity that only they can put to rights, and there's usually something at stake if they don't. And we feel for them because we fear the consequences if they fail. And this is where plot, theme, premise, and character are inextricably linked. In Star Wars, it's Luke that gets Leia's message. It's only Luke who'll take it to Obi-Wan, and then when his aunt and uncle are killed by the Empire, the fight becomes personal, so he joins the rebellion. And once he learns to trust his instincts and use the Force with Obi-Wan's help, only he can destroy the Death Star. And at every point it's biased towards him to prove the premise that instinct trumps knowledge. In Funny Girl, based on the life of comedian Fanny Bryce, they don't tell a whole life story, only the bits that suit their narrative, so they frame her as an underdog. They establish the inequity of her being treated as an ugly duckling in spite of her obvious talent. So we feel for her. We want her to overcome, to prove them wrong. And in the process, we admire her drive and her chutzpah, and we fear anything that threatens it. So by the end, when she stoically overcomes personal heartbreak to sing that final number, our hearts break with her. But here, what does Diana overcome? What's at stake? Why do we care? Because if it's about a woman who pays the price for a bad decision, Disney's Little Mermaid tells it so much more clearly. Ariel makes a foolish decision to give up her voice so she can walk on land and fall in love with the prince, only to realise that there are consequences. So she spends the rest of the show making up for it, making amends, and in the process she becomes a person who's worthy of the prince's love. But in this story, Diana's a naive girl who marries in spite of misgivings. She's deeply unhappy, but how does she solve it? She becomes a vengeful woman who publicly humiliates her husband to get what she wants. Are these traits we admire? A character we can invest in? What's the angle here? And look, we could argue that this is a condemnation of the crown, that Diana was so silenced she had to stoop to this level. But the writers make it out to be some kind of triumph. But what does this say about her character? Now, most stories build dramatic tension by keeping us guessing about the ending. But Diana's one of the most famous women of the modern era, so we kind of know how it ends. We're not hoping they'll patch things up and there'll be a happy ending. But in Superstar, we know how that ends. It's not a new story. So we're not asking what happens, but why. How do we get to this point, and why? That's the dramatic tension. The objective story is simply a guy who's crucified for his beliefs because they challenge the political status quo. And the conceit of this show is to view him as a superstar. The more famous he becomes, the more of a threat he becomes to the authorities because more people are listening. But we feel for his personal perspective, that conflict between his belief in the message and the burden of being the messenger. And it escalates to an impossible choice. Because yes, he could save himself and let the message die because he'll be seen as a fraud. Or he could allow himself to be crucified to let the message live. And that's a perspective we can care about. We might not agree with it, but we feel for this character in this situation, and we understand why it was the only choice he could make. So it becomes a story of self-sacrifice. And every good main character faces this leap of faith, do or die, dark night of the soul moment at the climax of the story. After all options are exhausted, this is the ultimate test of their character. They either rise to the challenge or they're consumed by it. In The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, backed into a corner, shows herself to be a true friend when she saves the scarecrow, thus defeating the witch. On the other hand, in Gypsy, Rose is so consumed with the pursuit of fame that she sacrifices her relationship with Herbie to create Gypsy Rose Lee, who ultimately outshines her. So perhaps more of a tragic figure. So if the climax resolves story and reveals character, what's the big moment for Diana? That's right. She sits down to a cup of tea with the Queen and politely asks for a divorce. Charles says, "Well, you are a good mother. No one can take that away from you." The Queen says, "Well, what do you want?" Diana says, "My freedom." And it's a done deal. There's no dark night of the soul here. 3 words: weak main character. And I'm only assuming Diana's the main character because her name's in the title, but she certainly doesn't function like one. She has no real drive. She's compliant, and not in an unassuming, industrious Cinderella kind of way. She learns about Camilla, but gets married anyway. She thinks marriage is going to be like a Barbara Cartland novel, then self-harms when it isn't. She has a baby. Charles cheats. She has another one. Charles cheats. She has an affair. So are the writers wagging their fingers at Charles, Camilla and the Queen? Or are they saying that Diana was a victim of her own delusion? I don't know. I find myself shouting, "Someone just drive this woman to the tunnel in Paris already." Too soon? But maybe we're looking at this wrong. Maybe Diana's not the main character. In Gypsy, based on the autobiography of stripper Gypsy Rose Lee, Louise, who later becomes Gypsy, is not really significant for most of the first act. So the writers made the canny decision to focus instead on the mother as the main character. Mama Rose, force of nature, mother of all stage mothers, and she drives the story. So it becomes a cautionary tale about living your life vicariously through your children. So even though it's Gypsy Rose Lee's biography, her facts. It's Mama Rose's story, and we connect with her from the beginning for the obstacles she overcomes. But in Diana, we don't really have a strong alternative character. Charles is a stodgy, philandering man-child who's pushed into marriage. Camilla is an unsympathetic adulterer. The Queen is an emotionally distant slave to duty. And they're all more talk than action, so they're not even good bad guys. And if Charles is the bad guy, how come he gets the happy ending? He ends up with Camilla and the blessing of the Queen, while Diana has to die. I mean, I know that really happened. She really did die, but this story could end with her freedom if that's the point of it. Or are they saying that freedom comes at a cost? Or that revenge destroys itself? And then they're all just so selfish, because most of the songs are just them singing about their own needs. And it's hard for us to care about them when they give so little of themselves and when they make so little connection with each other. You know, Charles and Camilla don't exactly spark with passion. I mean, maybe if they did, we'd feel more conflict. We'd understand him a bit more. Now, in The King and I, Anna and the King are practically electric by comparison. They're equally matched, but they're not antagonists because they're on the same side. They both want Siam to be seen as a modern scientific country. And the subjective story is about their relationship and a clash of values between honour and status. And the more they demand of each other, the more it diminishes their relationship. But the more they give of themselves, the more ground they concede, the closer they become, and the more we care about them. And they never kiss, but, I mean, that Shall We Dance sequence, I mean, you just tell me it's not one of the sexiest unresolved scenes in musical theatre. But in a bittersweet ending, the king dies. But not before conceding that Diana's impact on the young prince is good for Siam. So objectively, they both achieved their goal. Subjectively, we feel for Anna's loss in the king, but the positive resolution of their relationship proves the premise that honour outweighs status. So even though we might not think of it as a heavyweight story, it has this consistency that comes from a premise. But in Diana, the scenes are so fleeting, it's hard for us to feel connection between these characters. And the emphasis on the love triangle reduces the story of an icon to a tawdry domestic drama. It's just another bad marriage. By the time Diana becomes proactive in her life and she goes out in the town in that revenge dress and she publishes that tell-all biography, it all just seems so petty. So let's compare Diana to Evita, a similar story of a young woman who becomes a living saint to the people. Now, Eva Peron is not a nice person. By any measure, we shouldn't like her. She's ruthless, manipulative, self-serving. Yet she's also dynamic, resourceful, and charming. We empathise with her pain of being snubbed by her middle-class family. And this emotional scar becomes her strength, her drive. And so we admire her ambition. But the tragedy here is that her ambition is her undoing. As the country crumbles around her as a result of her own actions, her one strength to manipulate is sapped by her growing cancer, so she can do nothing about it. So her downfall proves the premise that ruthless ambition sows the seeds of its own destruction. And that's a big idea. But what's the big idea in Diana, other than the people that will change the world are not the ones you think will change the world? In Romeo and Juliet, their deaths are the result of events that they've set in motion, so it's inextricably linked to the theme. But in Diana, the car crash is a random event. It doesn't come as a result of anything that's come before, so it's not a tragedy. I mean, it's sad, but it's just a happenstance. Now, in a different approach to the story, you could make the case that Diana's toxic relationship with the press was her downfall, particularly if she courted it at any cost for her own validation. The premise then might be that vanity destroys itself, or vanity leads to its own destruction. But what if she compulsively courted that press coverage for a good reason, say to benefit the charities she genuinely cared for? Would we feel different? That premise might be that blind selflessness leads to destruction. Tragic, but maybe admirable. See how premise can change our perspective by connecting the facts to skew the argument? But the pieces in Diana don't come together, they don't add up, so there's no clarity or perspective. As a documentary, it's not informative or insightful. As a drama, it's neither deep nor compelling. And as a romantic comedy, please, there's no real romance and not much humour. I remember the day Diana died, and it was shocking and it was emotional and there was a genuine public outpouring of grief. But this show captured none of that, and I found myself strangely unmoved. So how else might they have approached this story? It could have been told from Camilla's perspective and Diana's the other woman. Or they could have limited the scope of the story and the time frame like they did in the film My Week with Marilyn. So they reveal the character of Marilyn Monroe through the eyes of a personal assistant in a very difficult week of her life when she was filming The Prince and the Showgirl with Laurence Olivier. Same thing with Hitchcock, with Anthony Hopkins and Helen Mirren. They don't tell Hitchcock's whole life story. We learn about him through the difficulties of making the film Psycho. This could have been that time period when she was recording tapes for the Andrew Morton biography. I mean, maybe she's wrestling with the decision to publish, so that when she does make the decision, it's momentous. And instead of focusing on the relationship with Charles, I mean, we can learn about it, but instead of focusing on it, this is about the relationship with Andrew Morton and how it ebbs and flows between trust and suspicion. Completely different perspective, but just as valid. Or maybe there are two Dianas, the naive girl and the world-weary woman. And there are two actors. Maybe this is in her hotel room before the crash, reconciling these two parts of herself and moving forward with her life. I mean, that could be tragic because we know what happens. Or they could change history entirely like Tarantino did in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You know, because we think we know where the story's going because the Sharon Tate Manson murders are, you know, part of public record. But then when he takes it somewhere else, it's surprising and subversive and strangely satisfying. Maybe Diana survives the crash. And thinking that there's a hit out on her, she shoots up all the senior royals Kill Bill style and installs William on the throne. And absolutely no attempt at naturalism. Who says it has to be real? Or they could play up the tawdry love triangle and this could be an outrageous sex romp like a Carry On movie.
Oh, Diana, we ought to be married.
Oh, Charlie, you really love me.
Of course I love you.
Whatever love means.
Oh, saucy.
Or maybe Diana never appears, and this is the day of her funeral. We learn about her through the conversations of people in pubs and in their homes and snippets of tabloids, and everyone has a different version of Diana. The point is, there are so many ways of telling the same story, and none of them have to be bland. And I'm not saying Diana ought to be salacious or controversial, but its lack of insight, its lack of inventiveness, perhaps is more objectionable than the problems with the music and the lyrics. So let's come back to that earlier question. Why this story? Why is a musical the best medium for it? When they've clearly put more effort into the staging than the story, I can't help thinking this is just a cynical exploitation of Diana's fame. Because I know there'll be a ready-made audience, if for no other reason than the curiosity factor. And that's a little sad. But hey, maybe you've seen it. Am I completely off the mark? Is there something I've missed? Let me know in the comments. Till next time, thank you so much for watching. Ranting. I find myself shouting, someone drive this bitch to the... Sorry. I find myself shouting, someone drive this woman to the... There. Why can't I get these words out? But I find myself shouting, someone drive this bitch to the tunnel in Paris already. Too soon?